NPO sector. What organisations do we have? What are their aims? What are their objectives? What sectors do they focus on? Where do they work? Step C, so understand the terrorist financing risks facing their specific NPO sector. So again, it's that understanding, it's that ability for us to do things afterwards and to have a knowledge base that informs what we're going to do. And then that final step, to ascertain whether the laws, regulations and other measures already in place are commensurate with the risks identified. So it's that risk, it's all about this risk-based approach, looking and identifying where the issues are and then identifying what can be done to tackle those issues. It's really hard to tackle issues if we don't know where they are, what they are, who's most at risk, who do we need to assist or target in that sense. You know, it's integral. It's really important from my perspective. Right, so now we're going to talk about the UK's domestic sector review. So our last domestic sector review was conducted in 2016 to 2017, was kind of the last time that we did one. But again, as I mentioned, we've got this process of constantly reviewing inquiries, cases, trying to understand if the picture is changing, and we're in that position now where we think it is worth redoing a domestic sector review because, you know, the picture's changed enough. We believe that it's worth it again. But there's parts where the picture hasn't changed. So the three primary components that we have. So the first one is that we identified and examined the size, scope and composition of the entire NPO sector in the UK. And this is that categorisation of, you know, how many big NPOs do we have? How many work in the education space? You know, what's the total number? What remits do they have? Just giving us that overall knowledge of what the sector looks like. Then we outlined the legal structures and reporting requirements of organisations within the UK NPO sector. So that was looking at what the legal structures were that we had in place and what reporting requirements we were putting on those organisations at the start, to just understand what information do we get and what structures do we have currently in place that apply. Because I think sometimes with legislation and laws, particularly we get this issue in the UK where something will emerge, like a threat or a vulnerability, and some will go, well, we need a new law for this. Well, sometimes, because the UK legal system's very, very old, we do have laws in place often that we can already use for these purposes. So we're quite fortunate in that sense. But we have those issues where an issue emerges and we think, oh, we need something new. Well, actually, sometimes we're covered by what we've already got. And then that final step in the components is we identified that subset of NPOs in the UK that fall within the FATF definition. So the Financial Action Task Force definition, which may be at the greatest risk of terrorist financing. So that subset, that smaller footprint of the wider NPO sector that we think we're at the greatest risk of terrorist financing. So what did we include? Well, the analysis kind of looked at a wide range of things, but some of the reports that we considered the findings of to help inform us were the Financial Action Task Force report on the risk of terrorist abuse in non-profit organisations, so that the typologies report that we've mentioned, which is publicly available. We used that. We used what was our 2015 national risk assessment, but also we were able to use the draft version of our 2017 national risk assessment to give that up-to-date kind of view of where the risks were, what the risks were scored at. And it allowed us, the fact that we have the ability to have this cross-government involvement in the national risk assessment is so important that it gives us that ability to be as up-to-date as we can be, and that we're not acting on old information. So it is important that, you know, our organisations and our institutions talk to each other and really help inform that. And then there's reports and studies on both the NPO sector in the UK and terrorist finance and abuse, so that wider net of reports and studies and the information that other organisations have collected, and using that open source based approach of just collecting as much information that will help us understand the sector. So the other thing to mention with the UK's domestic sector review is, you know, in the UK we've got devolved power, so actually our review was undertaken by 3 charity regulators. So we worked with our partners in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So the report as a whole, we were stated as the charity regulators because we were in that fortunate position that we had 2 partners that worked with us on it, and also it acts as that really like useful way of like checks and balances, understanding each other's sector and providing that critical friend that can look at the work and say, actually, this bit on yours needs this, you know, have you considered these gaps, have you considered that? And that's something, you know, critical friends is a key element, and it's something that we can really look to use a lot more of within this space. So the findings, what did we find out in terms of our domestic sector review in 2016-17? So the number of convictions for terrorist finance and abuse for the NPO sector was low. That was one of the key findings. But the terrorist financing risks within the NPO sector do exist. The risks may be low, but they are there. The terrorist financing risk within the NPO sector was found within charities offering services overseas, operating close to an active terrorist threat, with a focus on registered charities in England. So as that process where we used our partners in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and we regulate charities in England and Wales, we took all that data set and we managed to identify that, you know, it's a focus on those registered charities in England. So that geographic focus of where they registered, where they're based. So NPOs provide, as it says here, provide a wide range of services across society, both within the UK and abroad. And NPOs are effectively overseen and regulated by government and have a mature relationship, so in terms of participation in relevant policy development and criticising the government when this supports an NPO's purpose. So this was one of our findings, that, you know, this is what NPOs do, and what regulation we have, but also their participation. And I think that's one of the key things is, you know, involve NPOs, have the conversation, have that open forum. We're going to talk more about that later on with Tom, but, you know, for us that was important for us. So what was our methodology? How did we go about doing it? What were the stages? What were the steps? So stage 1 was our information gathering stage. So that was the review of the relevant FATF reports and documentations. And then it was also looking at our sector's data. You know, we've spoken already how much data we collect as the Commission in terms of annual return data, so where countries are spending their money. And we mined our own data, that of the Scottish charity regulator and the charity regulator in Northern Ireland, to really understand the sector and what casework we'd seen over over an extended period. So really giving us a really strong information basis to then inform us. Stage 2, partner input. So this was the contact that we had with all government departments that have a role in the regulation of MPOs in the UK, including those devolved departments. So it's thinking about in that context of the really useful one to look at is education. So we have the Department for Education in the UK. It was liaising with them around charities that focused on education and understanding their view and what information they had. And then gathering facts on the size of the MPO sector and the terrorist financing risk identified. The third stage was the analysis, review, and then the writing. So that was the ability of us to really pull all this information that we'd gathered together and identified, and the things that we'd seen from the casework, the overall sector, just trying to pull that all together and having a really strong assessment stage of that information. Because as you can tell, there was a significant footprint of information for us to look at, and it's really trying to understand within that, once you've got it all, to understand where the risks are, what are the vulnerabilities, where are the potential threats, and to give yourselves time at that stage. I think the key point here is stage 3, that analysis and the review and the writing. It's a long stage. There's a lot to do. They're all fairly long stages. But you have to give yourself time to do this, because the better that it's done, the better the information is analysed and looked at and reviewed, the stronger position you're in moving forward. And then we had the writing of the domestic sector review, and then the next stage, which it says there. So it's not just about writing the domestic sector review. That's great, but that doesn't help anybody if you don't share your findings from it, if you don't share that information with the partners and the sector. It's important. Sometimes we forget that the sector needs to know this information for them to do their own risk mitigation as well, for them to understand where the potential threats are. For newer MPOs that may have people in positions of trustees who are new to the sector. And we've talked about our guidance and our guidelines that we offer. But, sharing where risk sits. What are the risks? Where are the vulnerabilities? Where are the threats? It's really important, that sharing stage, because all that hard work that everyone's done in producing the domestic sector review, if we don't share the findings, it really kind of diminishes the work that has been done. And it is a lot of hard work. And yeah, we just want to put ourselves in that best place possible, that work that's been done can actually inform and achieve the goals that we've got. So this is what we saw. So MPOs, in terms of areas of higher terrorist financing risk. So what we've got here is kind of a breakdown of what we see in the UK. So we had 900,000 MPOs in the UK, of the whole MPO sector. Within that, we found out that from the information that we had, that 380,000 of these were charities. Of that, 16,000 of those charities operated internationally. We've talked about this before, with that figure of between 13 to 16,000 operating in certain areas of having areas of operation that made them vulnerable. And again, that final point, around 30% of these charities' annual income was more than £10,000. But as we see, those small charities that are operating internationally are less likely to have that access to that professional advice. It's that aim of, we identified that as a risk, and then it's identifying what we can do to fix that in that next stage, what can we do as a regulator to help those charities to understand what they need to do? And here, you know, this diagram of this was that small section of that entire charity sector risk overview. This is the whole picture in the UK. It's this small element of it that we've identified. So it's that targeted, that risk-based approach where we can take that small subsection that we really need to focus on and really channel our efforts into that of those that are at the highest risk. It just makes everyone's lives easier. It makes it easier to have that information base and to use that to then effectively assist. So here we have kind of the quote. So from the findings of our national risk assessment. So this is the national risk assessment for 2020. So our most recent one that's been done. I'm just going to read the quote from it. And I think we've seen this kind of already before. But the geographic areas of operation are a key factor in determining the terrorist financing risks faced by charities. There are several thousand charities that operate in areas in close proximity to terrorist groups. These are the charities most exposed to these terrorist financing risks. So we think again, that wide sector, everyone, that big picture, this is what we identified as those with the highest level of risk. And then here we go, that quote from Home Office and Treasury. So it is likely that where abuse has occurred, the charities involved would have been set up for legitimate purposes, but the individuals within the charities or individuals pretending to be associated with the charities have diverted funds for a terrorist cause. So it talks about the typologies that we've said before, about, you know, the 7 different types of abuse that we can see, and understanding that these were the ones that we saw the most of. And there we are. Questions?
Obrigada. Portanto, eu vou me referir à avaliação de risco e vou começar por dizer que no processo de avaliação mútua de Angola, o setor das ONGs, ou melhor, a recomendação 8 foi a única recomendação não conforme, o que significa dizer que o setor das ONGs não conseguiu responder a esta recomendação. E, entretanto, nós temos que reverter o quadro. Estamos instados a reverter o quadro. E para nós revertermos o quadro, naturalmente que nós temos que começar por fazer a avaliação de risco do setor. A minha questão é a seguinte. Atualmente, nós controlamos 525 ONGs. São as ONGs que estão inscritas no órgão supervisor. No entanto, em Angola existem 900 ONGs, um bocadinho acima, 900 e tal ONGs, que são ONGs que estão licenciadas, que estão legalizadas, que estão autorizadas a desenvolver a sua atividade em Angola. A nossa realidade é um bocadinho diferente. Diferente por quê? As ONGs, antes de virem inscrever-se no nosso setor, elas devem passar primeiro pelo Ministério da Justiça. E aí elas já estão legalizadas, já estão licenciadas e até já podem desenvolver a sua atividade. E depois é que elas se vêm inscrever ao órgão supervisor que as vai controlar a atividade que elas desenvolvem. A minha pergunta é a seguinte: para eu fazer a avaliação de risco do setor, eu faço avaliação de risco com estas 525 que eu controlo e estou a fazer a avaliação completa, ou tenho que ter as 900 ONGs que existem em Angola para poder fazer a avaliação de risco do setor. Será que se eu fizer a avaliação de risco só com as 525, eu estou a fazer avaliação perfeita ou incompleta? Muito obrigada.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think, you know, in the UK, the way we have it is that, you know, we do have charities that aren't registered with us, and as it's stated there, of that, looking at that NPO sector as a whole, we looked at the NPO sector, and it said there was 900,000 NPOs. But only 380,000 are charities that fall under our control. So it's looking at, you know, you say you've got a figure of potentially over 900 that are operating and 525 that are registered. I mean, it's not too dissimilar to the picture that we see, really, because we have, you know, that 900,000 figure, and then it's that 380,000 that are registered as charities. I think, from my perspective, in terms of the risk assessment, it would be understanding of those 900, which ones fall into that FATF definition of an MPO. You might have some that are in the 525 that don't, but you might have some in the wider over 900 that aren't registered that do. So it's, I think, from my perspective, it's looking at the whole sector and trying to understand within that, so that 900 figure, understand of that which ones fall into that definition, to then really be able to answer the kind of FATF recommendation as best as possible, would be my view. If Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, for me, I think the short answer is include all of them, right? That's the kind of the most basic answer. What you need to do is identify all those organisations in this country that meet that FATF definition of an MPO. So think about you know, are they charitable, religious, cultural? Do they carry out good works? Now that is probably going to include, I imagine, more than 900 that are registered, because we're talking about religious institutions, churches, which there will be many, many of them. Now, I think what you would need to do there is to try to make your best effort to try to categorise, you know, where those churches are and whether they're registered or not. Now, for our context, that's taken us a long period of time because of our kind of religious history. Churches weren't required to be registered as charities, so it was always very hard for us to define how many there actually are. So, as well as the ones that do register with us, which is now a legal requirement, we have to try to understand how many there are that aren't, which can be difficult. Now, a slight digression, but the way we did that was to do things like speak to overarching kind of umbrella bodies for churches. So say the overarching diocese of an area, to understand how many of those organisations are there. But for the purposes of FATF, you need to identify all those organisations that fall into this definition. So there's likely to be many more than that just aren't registered with either you or with the MOJ. Does that make sense?
Obrigado. Falou da a dificuldade que o Reino Unido tem de aconselhar ou controlar, não sei se percebi muito bem, as organizações, as ONGs internacionais. Eu pergunto, se o regulador tem um conjunto de ferramentas e mecanismos de controle e acompanhamento das ONGs nacionais e as internacionais, de onde surge então essa dificuldade de aconselhar ou quais são os receios que existem? Quais são as zonas cinzentas que têm sobre as organizações internacionais? Isto porque nós aqui em Angola também recebemos muitos pedidos de registro de organizações internacionais. Se calhar, ouvindo a vossa experiência, será uma mais-valia. Por favor. Obrigado.
Yeah, so again, really good question, and I think we will cover much of this in the sessions this afternoon, because we'll talk a lot about the types of things we expect, especially international charities, to do. Now, in general terms, what we want them to be able to do is, have good kind of governance controls in place, like good financial controls, for example. We want them to know where their money comes from, know who they support, and if they partner with any organisations, know who their partners are. And I'll go through all those principles in quite a lot of detail later on. But when it comes to international NGOs, and for all charities, as we've said over the last couple of days, the first line of defence to protect those charities are the people who run it themselves, because we are so small that we can't speak to them all in one go. Now, we give them plenty of advice, there's plenty of tools available and guidance that they can follow that we tell them about. But in the first instance, it is up to the trustees of the charity to manage their charity effectively.
Bom dia a todos. Eu tenho uma pergunta resultante da apresentação para o Ministério da Justiça. A apresentação diz-nos, e as obrigações das recomendações também nos exigem, que se classifique as ONGs de acordo com aquilo que são as recomendações do GAFI. A minha pergunta nesse caso seria a seguinte: uma vez que no pilar de supervisão das ONGs o Ministério da Justiça intervém como regulador, exige algum critério da parte do Ministério da Justiça ao olhar atento das ONGs mencionadas especificamente na recomendação 8? E tem outra pergunta para o MASFAMO. Quando o MASFAMO faz a supervisão destas, também tem um olhar atento às ONGs mencionadas pelas recomendações do GAFI? Obrigada. Temos alguém no Ministério da Justiça?
Sim, eu posso responder. Bom dia. O Ministério da Justiça não tem papel de controlar as ONGs. O Ministério da Justiça trabalha no processo. Trabalha no processo inicial até a legalização. Depois de atribuir personalidade jurídica, já não compete ao Ministério da Justiça controlar a atividade das ONGs. Quem controla é o outro órgão, que hoje é o nosso MASFAMO atual. Antigamente era o IPROCAC que fazia esse trabalho. Acredito que essa atividade ficou hoje para o MASFAMO fazer. Obrigado.
Permitam-me assessorar o meu colega. A intervenção do Ministério da Justiça no processo de formalização das ONGs, tal como disse o colega, resume-se na informação básica que os proponentes apresentarem, nos documentos que vão apresentar. Nós não vamos aprofundar, por exemplo, se eles fixarem no objeto social, na atividade. Nós não vamos questionar, mas será que efetivamente é isso que vocês vão fazer? A nossa análise não vai até ali. É apenas uma informação base. Baseia-se nos documentos que eles apresentarem, é à vista dos documentos que eles apresentarem. Obrigado.
Quanto ao Masfamo, enquanto supervisor, naturalmente que sim, naturalmente que o acompanhamento das ONGs tem que ter em conta as recomendações que são baixadas pelo GAFI. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, and I think if I could just, maybe just explain a bit about, again, about our context, which is that there'll be instances where an organisation will try to register with us, but we don't register them. Maybe they don't meet the legal test, or they carry out some political activity which they're not allowed to do through the UK charity law. But that doesn't mean that they don't fall into the FATF definition of an NPO. So they still need to be included in your domestic sector review, even if it's not some sort of registered entity. And hopefully that clarifies the point that, even though the organisation may not be registered with the MOJ, it will still exist and possibly carry out work in the country, therefore would still meet the FATF definition of an NPO and should be included in the assessment.
Eu gostaria de pedir o vosso auxílio para ajudar aqui as nossas entidades, que fosse feito um resumo das exigências do GAFI quanto à definição de ONGs que devem ter esse critério de supervisão diligente quanto às recomendações. Obrigada.
Was that for me? Yeah. Look, I think maybe that's something we can pick up afterwards and talk about a little bit more. From our, and if I understand the question correctly, from our perspective, that's the Charity Commission. So one agency that will register charities and then regulate them, right? So that's for us. But as I said yesterday, different countries do have different models. So there's no kind of right or wrong answer to how to do this. I suppose what's important is that you have those clear lines. Everyone knows what their responsibility is, and you share information effectively if those agencies are separate.
Yeah, just as Tom said, it's that collaboration and that information sharing. It's going to be so key. So that domestic sector review, as we've talked about, that some of those organisations that may not be registered will fall into that. So it's having those conversations between the agencies that are involved, and we have that in the UK. We have, as we said, there's the wider NPO sector that aren't charities. We understand that, and we work with our partners to understand that picture as well.
Obrigada. Eu gostaria de fazer um comentário. O relatório de avaliação mútua apontou insuficiências para o Masfamo. Essas insuficiências se referem à investigação, falta de investigação, a falta de acompanhamento dos fluxos financeiros das ONGs e a falta de aplicação de sanções. O Masfamo não tem foco para a investigação, o Masfamo não tem foco para olhar para a movimentação bancária, os fluxos financeiros que as ONGs manuseiam, o Masfamo não tem foco para sancionar. Eu gostaria de saber como é que nós, sozinhos, vamos ultrapassar isso. Ou nós estamos com peso nos ombros por causa do resultado da avaliação. Como é que o Masfamo vai ultrapassar isso? Já que o Masfamo tem... O foco é diferente, não tem nada a ver, é diferente. Nós antes tínhamos um instituto robusto que fazia tudo isso. Hoje estamos meramente a fazer nem sequer supervisão prudencial. E nós gostaríamos de aproveitar a experiência dos nossos preleitores para nos orientar como é que nós podemos ultrapassar para mudar o quadro ou a posição do mais famo junto da avaliação. Obrigada.
So, I think hearing a question about is MASHFAM the right body as it stands at the moment to actually implement recommendation 8 and the immediate outcome 10. I think the point on that is if it's not in a position to follow recommendation 8, then there should be looking at restructuring or building from the ground up, or a new organisation to deal with that. It's about, recommendation 8 is focused on towards the NPO regulator, so that's where it normally would sit, if that's a tax authority or a dedicated organisation. If it, at the moment, does not have the ability to do that, that is where more money will need to be sourced. The wider government and other politicians here in Angola will need to realise that, and I think the FATF assessment is quite clear. It is not going well, and resources will need to be funneled into the direction of the MPO regulator to be effective in this space. So it's about looking at where are our gaps, what do we need to do. Now remember, when we spoke earlier, we only have 20 members of staff at the Commission to deal with the counter-terrorism work. Now, that's in the context of 170,000. You have a sector, as it stands at the moment, of 525. So you've got to see, well, what resources do you need proportionately to deal with that issue? So you're looking at perhaps establishing departments or teams within the regulator to deal with that issue. So the positive to take from the mutual valuation is, yes, this is the time for us to get it right and to actually put in place. Look at your the countries around you. Look at how they deal with this issue. Don't you could look towards us, but you do have a number of countries in the region. So ask them how they deal with this issue. Go and read their mutual evaluations, see how they are set up, and then don't reinvent the wheel. You could look to seek support from others.
Yeah, I think we're now going to move on to our next session, which is, hang on, let me see if I can, what's going to happen now is we're going to do our breakout session. So this is for you guys, so Tom's going to hand out some questions that we're going to ask you as tables to look at. A couple of points from us before we let you guys get some discussion going around these. We've got a list of 10 questions for you to look at. If I could have the 3 tables on this side of the room, look at the first 5 questions, and then the 3 tables on this side of the room, look at the second 5 questions, so question 6 to question 10. If we could have that. The only other thing I will mention, that if you could all elect a spokesperson, so from the discussion you have, one of you speak at the end, because we're going to do some feedback and we can have discussion with us about kind of what you guys have raised then. But yeah, is that all good?
Yeah, so we'll you can have your discussions, and we'll cover it for 45 minutes, so till 1:45, and then we'll do some feedback before lunch, and then carry on the discussions afterwards. So get going, start the discussions.
Colegas, desculpa, a título de algum esclarecimento, nós temos divididos em todas as mesas integrantes do MASFAMO. Se perceberem, o questionário exige aqui a colaboração do MASFAMO nas respostas. Portanto, tem alguma mesa que não tenha um ou dois integrantes do MASFAMO? Ok, temos alguma mesa com 12 integrantes do MASFAMO? Precisamos das dispensas. Precisamos de um membro do MASFAMO na mesa 5, se faz favor. Temos alguma mesa que tenham 2? Precisamos também de alguém na mesa 6, ou então juntamos a 5 e a 6 com o integrante do MASFAMO. Eu vejo a mesa 3, acho que temos 3 pessoas do MASFAMO, certo? Então, prontos. Um na mesa 5 e um na mesa 6, se faz favor. Obrigada. Precisamos de alguém aqui na mesa 6 também. MASFAMO, bem haja. Uma salva de palmas ao MASFAMO. Sim, senhora.
see what they say. Right, if you can all start to close up your discussions, please. I'll just give you 1 minute to finish off what you're talking about. Most of them have got their headsets up, so they can't even hear. 1 minute. Yep. So that's 1 minute left, people. Should have probably done that. Well, we did say 12:45, didn't we? So. Right, if we can start to wrap up then your discussions, and then we can move into hearing back your feedback from your discussions. Just waiting for people to put their headsets on. Right then, so we'll go to the first couple of tables then to get their feedback before lunch. So, thank you. Everyone's so engaged in their conversation. They don't want to end it. If you can all put your headsets on, please, so you can. Thank you. Headsets on, please. Perfect. Thank you very much. We do not expect you to be able to answer all of these questions in the time that we have given, but what we wanted to do is to start those conversations, and from the looks of it, you were all really exercised and having really good conversations. So again, we don't expect you to be able to answer everything, but there was a good mix on the tables from representatives from various different organisations, and that was designed to help with these discussions. So tables on this side of the room were asked to look at some areas around understanding what the current landscape is, evidence of money laundering risk, the evaluation of the existing framework, oversight and regulation, and awareness and training. So that's the first 5 questions. So table 2, whoever is your spokesperson, if you would like to give us your feedback on the considerations of those questions, please. Thank you.
Então, a primeira questão que nos é colocada é compreender o panorama atual, que tipo de associações sem fins lucrativos são mais suscetíveis de branqueamento de capitais, financiamento ao terrorismo em Angola. Depois de uma intensa discussão entre os intervenientes, nós acabamos por concluir que as associações sem fins lucrativos que são mais suscetíveis de branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo em Angola, no nosso entender e na nossa realidade, são as associações que dependem de financiamento externo e que vivem única e exclusivamente de doações.
Instituições religiosas.
Obrigada. Preciso de repetir?
Sim.
Está bem. Depois de algumas discussões entre os componentes deste grupo, nós chegamos à conclusão que as organizações sem fins lucrativos que são mais suscetíveis ao branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo em Angola são as associações nacionais que dependem de financiamento externo, que vivem exclusivamente de doações, e aquelas instituições religiosas cujo braço solidário também depende única e exclusivamente de doações. A segunda pergunta. Evidências de risco de branqueamento de capitais. Que exemplos de branqueamento de capitais existem no setor das associações sem fins lucrativos? Exemplos de ações penais ou investigações. Na nossa realidade, eu não conheço nenhum caso. Não evidenciamos até hoje nenhum caso nas associações não lucrativas. Então, não aplicável para nós. Em relação à terceira, avaliação do quadro existente. Quadros regulamentares e jurídicos existem em Angola para proteger as associações sem fins lucrativos contra o branqueamento de capitais e o financiamento do terrorismo. São eficazes? Bem, nós temos estado a reger pela Lei 5/20, de 27 de janeiro, que é a Lei de Prevenção e Combate ao Branqueamento de Capitais, Financiamento ao Terrorismo, Proliferação de Armas, Destruição Massiva. Não existe, nós não temos nenhuma lei especificamente só para o branqueamento de capitais nas associações não lucrativas. É eficaz? É eficaz. Enquanto de forma geral é eficaz. Específico, nós não temos. A quarta, supervisão e regulamentação. É necessária uma maior supervisão e regulamentação das finanças e atividades das associações sem fins lucrativos. Em caso afirmativo, que forma deverá assumir? Na prática, não há supervisão. Se é necessária a supervisão. E é necessário um órgão supervisor efetivo e a criação de leis ou normativos que regulamentem a obrigatoriedade de prestação de contas das associações não lucrativas. Em relação à sensibilização e formação, naturalmente, as ONGs não têm domínio da informação em relação ao branqueamento de capitais, financiamento ao terrorismo. Precisamos de mais formação. É tudo, muito obrigada.
Thank you. That was a really interesting responses to those questions, and obviously the first one, if I can just ask a question about it, was it correct? It's those who are most susceptible to the risk. Sorry, those most susceptible to the risk. Is it those who have a religious aspect to their work? Is that what you're saying is your highest risk?
Sim, do nosso ponto de vista, sim.
E as outras? Acho que você falou de uma, você falou outra, faltou uma.
E aquelas nacionais que dependem única e exclusivamente de financiamento externo.
Okay. So, I'm not sure I've caught most of that because of this turned off. But why is it religious charities, NPOs, are at the highest risk? Because that external funding, is that what makes them higher risk for you?
Porque naturalmente, e no meu entender, naturalmente elas sobrevivem daquilo que lhes é dado. E é nesta sobrevivência que está o aproveitamento. Como não têm, quando o doador se aperceber que esta associação depende única e exclusivamente deles, pode naturalmente aproveitar esta fraqueza para poder utilizá-la ou abusá-la em relação ao branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have had that issue as well, where there is someone who can have control by virtue of them giving the funds, and also you could probably expand that from an individual but to a foreign government who may be giving funds to a charity for the purpose of an ideological or religious aspect. So there could be some sort of, so moving to this aspect of like hostile state activity. But yes, there's an ideological concern if there is a conditions on what that money should be spent on, or perhaps what should be taught in those NPOs, whether it's religious or not.
I think as well, just to follow up, we'll talk this afternoon about conditions on donations quite a lot, and it's very common for charities to be given a donation, say $100,000, on the condition that you give 50,000 of that to another organisation that the donor wants you to, the donor stipulates. Now, what's important is, do the NPOs know what they need to do if they receive that sort of request? Because, as you say, it can be very difficult for them because it's a lot of money, and they may need that money to survive, provide services, but then be used for money laundering. Now, our stance on this is that if a charity, an NPO, were to receive that sort of request, they should refuse. The NPO shouldn't be put in a position where they could be used in that way, and we are very clear in our guidance that is what we expect. That is their legal duty. But we'll talk about it in more detail.
Money talks.
Yes. I think I'm just conscious that we're coming up for lunch. So just one final question, I think, on your considerations is around question 4, and that the financial oversight. So what would you like to be able to do? What tools would you want to be able to have more of a financial oversight? So what resources, what would you like to see in order to make sure that you are happy with the risk, or be able to assess the risk? Or is that something that you don't know yet what you would like?
Não, na realidade o que nós gostaríamos de ter são recursos humanos capazes de poder fazer esta análise financeira. Nós não temos e nós não fazemos.
E a extensão todo o território da cidade.
E a extensão por todo o país, porque nós não temos a nível do país. Sim. Mas faz a resposta que eu dei.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any questions from yourselves at all. No, in which case, thank you very much. It was really helpful to hear what you've spoken about. It is now dead on lunchtime, so we're keeping well to our timings. We will do the feedback from the other tables at 2 p.m. So if everyone could be back here promptly for 2, and lunch is in, I'm assuming, the same place as it was yesterday, so upstairs. So thank you very much, and we'll see you back at 2.